You're not leaving me here by myself.
All right, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is Left Bank Books and SLU Women in Gender Studies presents Leigh Goodmark. Leigh is here to discuss her new book, Imperfect Victims, Criminalized Survivors and the Promise of Abolition Feminism, which has been named one of the best books of 2023 by Progressive Magazine. So we're very excited about that. Here to help us kick off the conversation in our Q&A tonight is Alicia Durford. So thank you for being here as well. Some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it funds our parks and our streets and everything that makes St. Louis an amazing place. And it helps us to support writers and put on events such as this. So thank you all for being here. For those of you joining us from our virtual audience, thank you for being here from afar. You'll be able to participate tonight as well by leaving your questions as a comment on YouTube, and I'll be monitoring that. So thank you for joining us from wherever you are. At Left Bank, we have a fantastic calendar of new events coming your way. So Tuesday, April 30th, Danielle Dutton will be here. She is the strikingly smart and daringly feminist author of Margaret the First. And she presents a prose collection like no other, where different styles of writing and different spaces of experience create a collage of the depths and strangeness of contemporary life and art. And on May 7th, St. Louis-based public speaker Ben Green will be here to present his new book, My Child is Trans, Now What? A Joy-Centered Approach to Support. Green focuses on providing two key resources, information and emotional support for families and youth. So a full calendar of all of our upcoming events is available on our website. There's sure to be something for everyone. For tonight's event, Leigh Goodmark is Marjorie Cook Professor of Law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, and the author of Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a balanced policy approach to intimate partner violence, as well as A Troubled Marriage, Domestic Violence, and the Legal System. Her new book is Imperfect Victims. It is a profound, compelling argument for abolition feminism to protect criminalized survivors of gender-based violence, and arguing how we must dismantle the carceral system. As author Victoria Law says, Goodmark challenges us to rethink long-ingrained notions of violence, safety, healing, and punishment to work toward creating the world we want to see. So please join me in welcoming Leigh and Alicia.
Hi, Leigh.
Hi, Alicia.
Thank you for this book. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you could start us off for those who are new to the topic, what you mean by criminalized survivors.
Criminalized survivors, and thank you for having me. Thank you to Left Bank Books for having us tonight. We really appreciate it. Criminalized survivors are people who have been convicted of crimes or who have been punished by the criminal legal system for things related to their own victimization. And so generally we're talking about people who have experienced some form of gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence, rape or sexual assault, or trafficking, which means that pretty much everything that we're gonna do tonight, for those of you online, because the people here already know, is a trigger warning. This is all really hard conversation that we're gonna be having tonight.
Great. And how did you come to this book? Can you tell us how it evolved?
Last 11 years have been representing criminalized survivors of violence in a variety of different kinds of proceedings, along with my students at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. So we represent folks in parole cases, in sentence modification, in commutations and federal pardons. And in addition to that, we volunteer in the prison in various ways. And so I was co-facilitating a group with lifers, and we were thinking about a project that we wanted to do. We decided to do a writing project where they would write their stories and I would write the framing, kind of the law, the social science background to kind of give some context to their stories. And so as with everything in the prison, you have to ask permission. We asked the warden for permission and were granted permission. And then we asked the Department of Corrections for permission and were denied. They said that it was illegal experimentation on incarcerated people. And so I talked with the women to tell them that we couldn't do this project, many of whom are my clients. And they said, we want you to do it anyway. It's important to us to get our stories out in the world. Will you do it? And so that's how this book came to be.
Thank you. So from what I know of your work, so we talked about the three books that you have, right? There's definitely a trajectory from a troubled marriage through decriminalizing domestic violence to now imperfect victims. Could you speak to that? Because that's not what you started out doing in your law career, right?
Not at all. And so I would go even further back to when I came out of law school in 1994. 1994 is the same year as the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. And at that time, people who were coming out to work with survivors of violence like I was very much believed that the way that we handled this problem was through the criminal legal system. That men, and at the time we were only talking about men as the people who did harm, who committed acts of violence, were irredeemable, were not changeable, and the only way to deal with them was to put them in prison. And that was the received wisdom of the time. And the anti-violence movement had worked really hard to bring the movement from a place where law enforcement was largely unwilling to intervene in these cases to one where law enforcement became our primary way of responding to these cases. And I believe that. My Twitter handle is recovering carceral feminist. Ask me how. I am the original carceral feminist. And I say that not as an insult, although that's how many people use it, but as an explanation or as a descriptor. But I started working with clients, and the clients said, this isn't going to work for us. This isn't going to work for our families. This isn't what I need. What I need is help with parenting. What I need is for the violence to stop, but not for my partner to go away. I can't afford for that to happen. I'll be ostracized from my community. My clients weren't interested in criminalization, and their senses of their partners were far more nuanced than my senses of their partners. And so I started to learn. And so I did the work, and I did the work, and I did the work. And then I came to academia in 2003. And when I got to academia, I took the opportunity to really start to look at what the literature said about the use of the criminal legal system. And what I learned then was that Black feminists and feminists of color from the beginning of the anti-violence movement had been saying, this isn't going to work for us. This isn't going to work for our families. Mari Matsuda in 1994 in Ms. Magazine says, why are you so excited about VAWA? This is going to be terrible for our communities. And really started to change the way that I looked at all of this. And so in 2012, I wrote A Troubled Marriage. And that book, it essentially says, the legal system is not a great way to respond to intimate partner violence, but we can fix it. Here are the things we can do to fix it. And also, we should be looking outside the legal system for people who don't necessarily want that. And I kept working, and I kept practicing, and I kept learning. And I started to read more deeply. And I read Beth Ritchie, and I read Andrea Ritchie, and I read Angela Davis, and I read, the feminists of color who were deeply grounded in this work, saying this is not working for us. And I continued to watch the system fail and fail and fail. And one of the interesting things actually in 2012 was how strong the backlash against the first book was. And that book was pretty tame. It just said there are things that are not working, but we can fix them. And the kind of the mainstream anti-violence movement was deeply offended and deeply hurt by the idea that the work that they had done to get the criminal legal system to intervene could possibly be hurting the people that we had been trying to help. So in 2018, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence comes out. When you write a book with a title like Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, you are aware at that point of the backlash that will happen. And that book says, in fact, criminalization is not decreasing or deterring intimate partner violence. It's exacerbating many of the correlates of intimate partner violence, and it's hurting the people that we meant to help. It's a problem. But at the end of that book, I say, decriminalizing domestic violence is unlikely, which I still believe to be true, and probably unwise. So I punted. Spent a whole book telling you why the criminal legal system doesn't work, and then could not go all the way to, and therefore we need to dismantle that system. Interestingly, in 2016, when I first started talking about it, it was, how dare you? You're going to take the movement back 1,000 years. You're endangering women. This is horrible. What are you doing? And by 2020, it was, why is this not an abolitionist book? And why are you not an abolitionist? And I think for me, as for many white people, something changed in 2020. I don't know why it wasn't the murder of Mike Brown or the murder of Eric Garner or any of the thousands of police murders that happened prior to 2020. But for me, the murder of George Floyd changed something. It was the first time when I really thought, this system can't be fixed because it's operating exactly the way it's supposed to operate. This system is designed to repress and to harm people of color. That's what it's doing. There's no fixing that. The other thing that had changed for me was that I had started representing survivors of violence. And so I was in prisons regularly starting in around 2013. And although I had worked with incarcerated survivors a little bit before that time, being in prisons on a day-to-day basis changes the way that you look at the criminal legal system. I work in a prison that is a decent prison as prisons go. I would not want to be there for any amount of time. I certainly don't want my clients to have to be there. It's the idea that, as Brian Stevenson says, of getting proximate to the problem. And so by the time that this book comes out in 2023, I feel that I can say, yeah, I'm an abolitionist. I don't believe in the use of the carceral system to address any kinds of problems. I don't think that we should be using punitive state power in the ways that we use punitive state power, and in a variety of ways that we use punitive state power. And so that's the trajectory. And I appreciate the question a lot. It took me 28 years to get there. And it's a hard ask for a lot of people. And so I like to talk about the way that I have changed over time, because I think it helps people to see that change is possible, that change takes time. And in a world where I think we're so often quick to judge people for not being everything that we want them to be in that moment, or for changing their positions over time, I think it's an important thing to do. And so I appreciate the question.
Thank you. And to follow up on that, one of the things that most was compelling to me about this book is kind of how you're interweaving this analysis of structures in the criminal legal system and so forth, but you also interweave stories. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about one or two of your clients and the stories you share in the book?
Sure, and I want to preface it by saying I only talk about clients with their permission.
Okay.
And I only talk about people I know with their permission. Other people that I talk about in the book, I use publicly available sources to talk about their cases, because I think it's really important for people to have control over that. And I don't talk about my clients who are still incarcerated, because with two exceptions, both of whom very much wanted me to talk about them, because I don't think it's safe for me to do that for people who still have parole, for example, to deal with, or have the possibility of coming back into court to try to have their sentences overturned. So that being said, one of the people I talk about is a woman named Arena Pretty. When Arena was 18 years old, she was involved in an abusive relationship, and her boyfriend said to her he wanted to rob the store where she worked, and she was going to get him into the store so that he could rob the store. She didn't want to do that. She did not want to be part of it, and she didn't really have a choice. And so she went with him to the store that night, because he knew that the owner of the store would let her in a way that the owner wouldn't let her boyfriend in. So they go to the store, he lets her into the store, and they go to the back of the store where this robbery starts. And he says to Arena, you need to help me tie up these people. She says, absolutely not. I didn't even want to be here. So starts to tie up both the owner of the store and the other man who's there. And she says to them, it's going to be okay. He's just going to rob you. It's going to be okay. And then she runs. She gets out of there as quickly as she can. And as she's running away, she hears a gunshot. And what she learns a couple of days later is that her boyfriend has shot both of the men, killing one of them and wounding the other. And so Arena is tried for felony murder because she is present at the commission of a felony that results in a death. And she actually pleads to first-degree murder, which nobody pleads to first-degree murder, in exchange for the death penalty coming off the table. And she is sentenced to life in prison. She goes into the prison at 18. There's no programming for her. She has a young child. She leaves her child with her mother. She is forced to learn on her own how you prison at age 18. And over time, as other young women come to the prison, she becomes a mother figure to them. She mentors them. She goes into educational programming. She gets her degree. She gets her college degree. She gets her master's degree in sociology before, of course, all college and higher ed programs are stopped at the prison. She works in the correctional enterprises. She does every program that's available to her, and she waits, and she waits, and she waits. And she goes before the parole commission 6 times. The first 3 times, they just say, you got to come back in some period of time. The second 3 times, they say, well, we think you're ready for parole, but in Maryland at that time, the governor also had to approve any lifers who were granted parole. And she's denied once by the governor, and twice by the governor, and 3 times by the governor. And so by the time the pandemic starts in 2019, she has been incarcerated for 41 years. And then she gets COVID. She's already got health conditions because prison is the worst place to be to maintain any kind of good health care. Prison health care is appalling. It's an oxymoron. She's taken out of the facility. We don't know where she is. They don't tell her family. They don't tell us. We're panicked. And then the courts say, we're going to allow for the release of some folks who are vulnerable to COVID, who would not otherwise be eligible for release if you can figure out a way to get them back into court. And amazing lawyering by some folks that I care deeply about to find a constitutional issue that could get us back into court. And at the time, a progressive state's attorney who, despite some of my other differences with her, was willing to reconsider old convictions. We were able to come to an agreement with them that they would agree that there was a constitutional violation and they would recommend that she be released. And so after 42 years in the middle of the pandemic, Arena Pretty is released. She was the longest serving woman in Maryland history at that time. And the minute that she walked out of the prison, I realized that I still represented the longest serving woman in Maryland because she was still in there. Arena is now working at a wonderful place. It's a transitional home for formerly incarcerated women. She is the same mothering, grounding, wonderful presence in that position that she was for the women that she mentored in the prison. She's gotten married, she's got home. She is absolutely doing wonderfully well. And what it shows you is that she didn't need to be there at all. She didn't need to be there in the first instance, but she surely didn't need to be there for 42 years.
And what was the original? I lost in the structure. Like, what did she initially do? Could you just remind us what she served 42 years for? What was that initial?
She served 42 years for allowing her boyfriend to come into the prison with, to come into the store with her, where he committed a murder. And because she was part of the robbery that led to the murder, she was held responsible for the murder. That's what she did.
And is this an atypical story? Like, you talk a little bit about how these survivors come into contact. So how is this not an atypical story?
This is not an atypical story in about a million different ways. So first of all, Arena Pretty is a Black woman. It's not atypical in that way. Arena Pretty is a survivor of violence who is committing a crime, not because she wants to commit a crime, but at the behest of an abusive partner. That makes it a typical story. Arena spends a ridiculous amount of time in prison, and it takes moving heaven and earth to extricate her from that prison. That is a typical story. She's incarcerated for felony murder, which is a huge source of incarceration for criminalized survivors, who are often acting at the behest of, under duress from, their abusive partners and are involved in crimes that they are not the main players in and that they do not commit. They don't kill anyone, they don't hurt anyone, but they're there. So she is typical in that way. But she's also typical in that I hesitate to use the word rehabilitation with my clients. I use it in the context of parole because we have to. But most of them didn't need to be rehabilitated. There was nothing wrong with them in the first place, except that they were survivors of violence who found themselves in situations that led to their incarceration. But Arena used every minute of her incarceration to better herself, to better her community, to be a positive force in the lives of everyone around her. And that's typical too. So many of my clients do that work. As young women, they often struggle when they first get to prison. They're angry, they're dislocated, they miss their children, they miss their families. They sometimes get infractions for things that are really all about that frustration and rage and everything that comes with being incarcerated. But what you see with people, particularly who have long sentences, and this is, I think, true in the men's population many times as well. That's just not my population that I work with, but among my clients, that stops. You see it, maybe some infractions early on, and then people just go and they try to build the best lives that they can build under those conditions, and that's pretty typical too. And so I have now probably 10, 12, 15 clients released from life sentences, all of whom had served at least 20 years before they were released, who followed that same path, who were there not out of anything that they did, but because of things that happen to them, either in protecting themselves from an abusive partner or because of something that an abusive partner did, who use that time as best they could to parent their kids, to be a source of support to their families, and to create family within the institution.
Now, there's a lot of back and forth, and there's decriminalizing domestic violence up front. One of the things that I appreciated about this book and that last book is in that last book, you have chapters that are saying, well, if domestic violence isn't a legal problem, like what kind of problem could it be? Which to me is a foundation of this book. What are some of the ways we could look at domestic violence if it wasn't a legal problem?
So in that book, I argue that we should look at intimate partner violence as an economic problem, as a public health problem, as a community problem, and as a human rights issue. And so thinking about the data on economics, for example, one of the things that is clear from the research is that low-income women are much more likely to be victimized by their partners, that economic stress is highly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. During the pandemic, one of the really interesting things that happened was you saw rates of intimate partner violence climb in the early part of the pandemic, and then they dipped quite a bit. And they dipped at the same time that people got stimulus checks. Decreasing economic stress decreases violence. So thinking about how we can eliminate economic stress so that we can bring down rates of violence. In terms of public health, thinking about prevention. What's the work that we do to prevent adverse childhood experiences which are highly correlated again with the perpetration of violence? What's the work that we do to mitigate trauma, which is correlated with the perpetration of violence? What's the meaningful work we can do to help people who have used violence change? Because so much of what we call offender intervention programming is not working. And partly I think it's not working because it relies on an outdated feminist narrative that won't take into account things like the trauma that someone has experienced before they start using violence. Mm-hmm. What can we do around adolescence to help kids see what healthy relationships look like, what unhealthy relationships look like? What does that prevention space look like? And then how do we get rid of guns, which is a huge part of this conversation? And how do we get rid of alcohol, which is a huge part of this conversation that most people don't want to have? But the data is pretty clear about the correlation between alcohol and the perpetration of violence. So all of that preventative stuff in the public health realm. Then in the community realm, thinking about how do we resource and train and facilitate and give communities what the tools that they need to intervene productively in cases of intimate partner violence. Half of people never call law enforcement in the first instance. So what is it that they're doing? They're going to friends, they're going to family, they're going to clergy, they're going to other folks in the community. We're not resourcing people. We're not helping people have the tools that they need to be useful partners in that exercise. So there are all kinds of things that we can do in the community-based space that would address people's needs. And so the question, the way that connects to this book is that, of course, if you start to talk about not using the criminal legal system to do this work, you have to then think about, well, what do we do, right? What work does happen? And I think all the stuff that's in Decriminalizing Domestic Violence is the answer to, well, if we get rid of the criminal legal system, then what?
But then this is a whole nother book on top of that, right? So how does Abolition, Feminism, and the work of Alyssa Vieira and Beth Ritchie and Angela Davis and Andrea Ritchie, how does that add to what you're doing? Why isn't just those plus the legal system?
What their work tells us, along with the work of lots of other folks, as well as the lived experience of a great many people, is that the criminal legal system is not a problem-solving system. It is not going to make things better. What it's going to do is to police and repress and harm mostly people of color, mostly folks from other marginalized communities, folks from the LGBTQIA community. That's what it exists to do. That is not a helping system. That is not a system that fixes things. And so what Abolition Feminism says is we reject the intervention, the use of punitive state systems to solve our problems. That's not going to be the way that we get to the results that we want. And instead, we have to find other ways to address these problems. What we've done largely as a community is to outsource all responsibility for solving our problems, including the problems of violence, to the state. And the state does that through punishment. We have to reclaim the responsibility for responding to problems without using the punitive power of the state. That's the work that Miriam Kaba and others have done around transformative justice, and that's, I think, that's the framework within which we can understand what things look like on the other side. But you can't overstate, like, this exists because of all of the work that Black feminists did. And what's interesting to me about that is that so many of those Black feminists came out of the anti-violence movement. So Angela Davis has been saying forever, if you care about intimate partner violence, you should be at the forefront of abolitionist struggle. Beth Ritchie and Miriam Kaba came out of Chicago's anti-violence movement. They saw what happened when you used the carceral system, when you built it up to respond to intimate partner violence. They saw the damage it did to communities of color, to Black and brown women, to LGBTQIA folks. So that transition is not at all surprising that you would have those folks be the folks kind of creating the conversation around what this can look like. I think what my book contributes is the legal piece of things, and of looking at, okay, what does it really mean when we put people in these systems? What does it mean for a witness to an act of intimate partner violence when we use the criminal legal system to lock them up until they testify, to force them to testify? Because that's happening, and I don't think people know that it's happening. But what does it mean when a victim goes in to get help from a court and is locked up because she talks in a way that the judge doesn't like? That is using the criminal punishment system to do that work. And then all of the different kinds of things that I talk about in the book, felony murder, that I think people are not aware of, particularly failure to protect, when mothers of children are held responsible for the violence that's done to those children by their partners. Moms who are being abused, who are doing their best to protect themselves and their children, find themselves incarcerated. I have so many clients incarcerated for failure to protect, and it's not even as bad in Maryland as it is in other places. Oklahoma, worst in the country. And I tell the story of Tondelo Hall. It's a story that some of you may be familiar with, who was getting ready to leave, left the house to go get her stuff together. She was leaving the abusive partner the next day. She comes home, her child is hurt, takes the child to the hospital, learns the child has not only been hurt that day, but had been hurt previously. And she enters what's called a blind plea, where she says, I'm going to plead guilty. I'm going to testify against him. And then you'll sentence me after I testify. I don't know what the sentence is going to be. So she goes to testify against him. But what they don't do is they don't put her in a facility that's separate from him. So they're in the same facility, and he is sending her notes through the facility. One day he sends her a note. It's a picture of a hand. He says, this is my hand. Imagine it slapping your face. They're transported together to and from the prison. She's seeing him every day. She knows what's going to happen. And so when she goes to testify against him, she is understandably nervous. The prosecutors freak out. They think, and also the prosecutors make a huge mistake that is totally their fault, that undermines their case hugely, but they blame it on her. And they think they're not going to get their conviction. So they let him plead. He pleads guilty, and he gets time served, 2 years, which he's already served, waiting for the trial. And he's done. He walks out. And when Tondelo goes to be sentenced, they say she gets the maximum sentence. We want to hold her because it's her fault that he got to walk. So not only did she let him hurt the children, it's her fault that he got to walk. She is sentenced to 30 years in prison.
And is this typical? Is this atypical? I mean, is
Oklahoma is a little atypical in that it is more extreme than other places, but I have clients who are serving 10 and 20 years for the same thing.
Even though their abusers are serving less or no time?
In some cases.
Do you want to talk about another case where that's true?
I don't, because
Okay.
that client is still incarcerated, and I don't want to share that story. If that's okay.
Perfect. I have heard you talk elsewhere about accountability and justice and the difference between the two. How about that then?
Sure.
Okay.
So, I want to talk accountability and punishment, I think, are the things that I would distinguish.
Okay.
In the anti-violence movement, one of the key concepts is that people should be accountable for the harm that they do. And I think we all can agree about that, right? People should be accountable when they do things that are harmful to other people. We have equated accountability with punishment. And we have told people that the only way that you can hold someone accountable is for them to be punished through the criminal legal system. And that is what we have called justice. And so if you want justice as someone who has been subjected to abuse, what that looks like then is for that person to be punished in some way. We don't offer people what they might need to feel justice, and we don't talk to them about what would justice feel like for you. But if you had that conversation with people, what you might hear instead is, I need economic support. I want this person to acknowledge what they did. I want our community to acknowledge that they knew what was happening but never said a word about it. I need a place to live. I want an apology, right? There are all kinds of ways that people might experience justice that's different than punishment. But because we tell people that justice is punishment, that's what they ask for. So people ask me all the time, as an abolitionist, what if your client wants somebody to be incarcerated? If that's what my client wants, then that's what my client wants. But I would suggest that part of the reason that is what my client wants is because we haven't offered them anything else. The criminal legal system is the primary response to intimate partner violence in the United States. We don't do much of anything else. We don't offer much of anything else. So of course people want that. It feels like justice.
So what could we offer?
So we could offer any of the things that I just suggested, right? We could offer people real economic support. We could offer people real community support. We could embed people in communities that can help them to feel safe and to feel validated. We can create community-based justice tribunals where people can talk about what happened to them and get the community to provide them with the kind of validation and vindication that people so often want. We can do micro work and we can do macro work. We can do restorative justice. But I always hesitate when I talk about restorative justice because people talk about restorative justice as though you can take the criminal legal system, pick it up and put it over here and plunk down restorative justice and that's going to be the replacement. And it doesn't work that way for lots of reasons. Restorative justice is time intensive, it's labor intensive, it's resource intensive. It should only happen if it's something that the person who's been harmed wants to have it happen. And it should only happen when there are facilitators who understand the dynamics of intimate partner violence so that they can bring people through the process in a way that feels safe and validating. And it really can't happen if the person who's done harm isn't willing to take responsibility for that harm in some way. So there are lots of conditions, right, for that to be useful, but it's another tool that we could be using. So there are all these other things that we could be thinking about doing. That all is from Decrim. I talk about that all in Decrim. I also think, in terms of this book, if people aren't quite at abolition, right? If you feel like I'm here but not quite there, there's all kinds of stuff we could be doing that's short of full abolition that would have tremendous positive consequences for the clients that I serve. So we could get rid of mandatory arrest laws. Mandatory arrest laws are laws that require police to make an arrest whenever they have probable cause to do so. Since the inception of mandatory arrest laws in the United States, arrest has gone up a lot, but it's gone up for women more than anyone else. Alicia's work told us this years ago, not because women were all of a sudden more violent, but because of the way police were using those policies. So, and they, of course, they're used disproportionately against Black and brown women. So we could get rid of mandatory arrest. No other crime has mandatory arrest. There's no reason we have to have it, but it brings girls into the system because girls are being arrested, particularly in fights with their parents, and disproportionate numbers of girls are being caught up in mandatory arrests. And it brings women into the system, and it brings other folks who are harmed into the system. We could get rid of it. We could get rid of felony murder. Lots of states have. There's no reason why somebody who's never killed anybody should be responsible for someone else's death in that way. You can hold them responsible for other things, I guess, if you want to, but not for that death. Right? And the difference in that sentence would be significant. We could get rid of mandatory minimum sentences. Mandatory minimum sentences are keeping criminalized survivors in prison for much longer than they otherwise would be there. A woman named Dixie Shanahan in Iowa, her jury was shocked when they found out that her second-degree murder conviction brought with it a 50-year sentence. They said, we never would have convicted her. We knew that she had been a victim of violence for 19 years. We knew what she had endured. We didn't want her to go to prison for 50 years. But we don't have to have mandatory minimum sentences, right? So there are things that we can do along the way to mitigate some of the harm that the system is causing.
If I want to get involved in this type of movement, right, and love the support of Left Bank Books and that you should purchase this from Left Bank Books, and I read this and I want to get involved and I want to do something that also feels really big and amorphous and scary and that I might do it wrong. What would you say to that person? What could they do?
So in places where there are political organizing homes for this work, get with those homes. And so there aren't that many of them, but the Survived and Punished movement is a nationwide movement. You can connect through kind of online. New York and California have Survived and Punished movements. In Chicago, Love and Protect is doing that work. I am sure it is being done here in St. Louis. I don't know who's doing it here in St. Louis, but I would suggest to you that probably Arch City Defenders does, and they would know how to connect with that work. So connect, find the political home for that work. And then you can get involved in survivor defense campaigns. So the reason that we know the names of people like Risha Meadows and Marissa Alexander and Centoya Brown is because of the survivor defense work that was done on their behalf. And survivor defense campaigns can be things like letter writing and creating petitions and fundraising and making art and showing up to protest at courthouses and doing support for the family. There's so many different ways you can be involved in survivor defense. If you're interested in that work, Nikki Adamando, who is a survivor in New York, who's recently been released from prison, her sister Michelle wrote a book called Dear Sister that talks a lot about the survivor defense campaign that they put together on Nikki's behalf. So there's all kinds of work like that. And then there are, prisons run on volunteerism. And I think, some people don't want to do that because it feels like shoring up the system. But for me, I think that work matters because the people who are in the prisons rely on it so heavily. They don't get programming unless volunteers bring programming in. And what my clients have consistently said is, you and your students make us feel like we're not forgotten. We felt like we were just, we were put here and we were forgotten. To feel seen is such an important thing. And so to volunteer with incarcerated people, and if you want to volunteer with incarcerated survivors of violence, you pretty much just walk into the women's prison, because I have yet to go into the women's prison and meet somebody who is not an incarcerated survivor of violence. And of course, because I consider prisons a form of state-sanctioned violence, everybody who's in there is experiencing it, right? Everybody who's being strip searched is being sexually assaulted on a regular basis. And so you will have the opportunity just by volunteering to do that work. Dismantling everything is huge, right? It requires so many different things. But I think about something that Miriam Kaba says a lot. You don't have to do all of it. You just have to find the thing that you do. And you have to be dedicated to that thing, and you have to do it well. And when we all do that together, that's how we're making change. One person is not going to change all of this. But when we have concerted and collective and collaborative effort, then we can make change.
I'm very glad that you do the thing that you do. You do many things well. Thank you. Should we open it up for questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I came here very late, and I just bought both of your books. Thank you so much for being here. So I am an OBGYN resident here in St. Louis. And when you talk about do the thing you do and do it well, I feel like it is just, everything is stacked against us in the medical system. Whether or not we try and screen for domestic violence in our clinic, but it is just so challenging from a mistrust perspective, just from a patient's not wanting to tell their story in the moment perspective as well. And I really try and hear my patients, and I think it's been nice to take care of people that look like me in St. Louis, which has been a big change.
Yeah.
I feel at a loss in a sense. And I don't know, do you have any advice, like when you feel like you're just up against a wall and you can't really do anything to move things forward for people?
Yeah. So I started out as a victim side person, but in the last 10 years, I've become a criminal defense lawyer. It turns out criminal defense lawyers lose all the time. All the time. We lose so much more than we win.
I have a friend who's a criminal defense lawyer here.
Yeah, and so I face the same thing where I feel like we push and we push and we push. Again, we tried to get Arena out. All those, I was there for several of the times that the governor said no. I'm the one who got to tell her. The governor has once again said no, right? It's awful. One of the things that I talk to my students about, and I don't know exactly how this translates for you, but I hope it'll be helpful, is that we've redefined what winning means. So for me, I can't look at winning and losing in court as the way to measure whether we're being successful, because then we're not. If our clients feel heard, if they feel validated, if they understand what is happening to them in the process, and they feel like they've gotten the best possible voice in the process, that's a win. Just having people be treated with dignity in these systems is a win. And so that's how we define success. And I think my clients would probably say the same thing. They know once you've been convicted, everything is stacked against you. It's so hard. It's so hard to get somebody out of prison. But what I get all the time are letters that say, thank you for not forgetting about me. Thank you for what you're doing for me. I know, thank you for thinking of me. That matters to people. It matters a lot. So just being you in that space is saying something to your patients. Something really, really important, even when maybe it feels like you're not making all the change that you want to make. The stuff that we're trying to change, it's huge and it's hard and it's hardwired and deep baked into this country in many ways. To think that any of it's going to be, to go without a big fight, probably not. But when you see a patient who gets the care that they maybe wouldn't have gotten otherwise because you've treated them the way that people should be treated, as opposed to other people within that system, that's a huge win. That's a change.
That does translate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We thank you for your work and all the, sharing that you've done about kind of your journey. I really appreciate that. I have a similar journey, having started in working in the DV shelters in the 1980s. And I guess my question kind of ties in with, what is your relationship like with the advocacy community? And is it adversarial? Have you found a way to kind of still join, even though you have, pretty different perspectives? And how do you navigate that space?
Depends on who you ask in the advocacy community. I have great relationships with some people. No, I was on the board of 2 different shelters. I've definitely done all of that stuff. But there are also organizations that really, really don't like me much. Nobody invites me to go to the national convenings on VAWA anymore since I've been pretty vocal about my opposition to it. So, or to the way that it funds things. But I think, what's interesting to me about that question particularly is the change that we're seeing in the anti-violence movement. So there are places in the movement now that are doing race equity work, that are explicitly anti-carceral. And there are, coalitions that are bringing me in to talk to their folks about how do we do this differently. I was down in Georgia. The Georgia Coalition has a survivor advocacy project. They're doing this work, and I was down there to talk to them about it. I'm going to New York to talk to them about this work. There's great work that's happening. And then in the national movement, you probably know already, right? A couple of years ago, again after the murder of George Floyd, every state coalition signed the Moment of Truth letter that took some responsibility for the deeply racist way that the buildup of the carceral state in response to intimate partner violence had played out. You could have knocked me over with a feather, right? The idea that all of the coalitions were willing to say, we have been complicit in creating this deeply racist, deeply carceral space was absolutely revolutionary. So I think the movement is changing. And I like to think that maybe, and you start to see some things that I still think are misguided, but are things that are interesting. So for example, they're now writing restorative justice into VAWA. That's problematic for 100 different reasons. But the idea that even anyone engaged with VAWA is thinking about restorative justice, or even thinking that they should be thinking about restorative justice, is a huge difference from 5 or 10 years ago. So I think the movement itself is changing. I still encounter advocates who are hurt and insulted, in the same way that I'm going to get it backwards. I know I'm going to get it backwards. The personal is political, right? So in the same way that the personal is political, the political is personal. And for advocates who fought really hard for things like mandatory arrest laws and no drop prosecution, to have me say to them, these are terrible things that are hurting people, it really gets to the core of their identity as advocates. That's mostly though the lawyers. Advocates, in the way that we talk about shelter advocates and other advocates, have always known that the legal system was screwed up. They've always known that it wasn't going to be a good response for people. So they're fine with me for the most part. But lawyers are not so much, not always anyway. But I do think it's changing. I absolutely do. I have so much hope about that.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
I want to ask you about blind pleas. How often are you seeing blind pleas, and are you seeing them disproportionately with IPV?
I couldn't even begin to answer that question. I don't have a systematic kind of study or count of it, so I don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen them that much in my cases. None of my clients has taken one.
Okay.
I bet you though in Oklahoma there are a bunch.
In Georgia.
In Georgia too?
Mhm.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Similar to mandatory sentencing, I'm interested in mandatory reporting.
Yeah.
I was a trauma therapist for a while, and it was a really hard dance to want people to come to you, but to have everybody recognize that that's going to take a lot of power out of their hand if they say the wrong thing. So curious, and just from a therapist perspective in terms of like duty to warn, and there's a lot of really complicated stuff that goes into it. It might be outside your scope, but what are your thoughts on mandatory reporting and the impact that has?
So I am as opposed to quasi-carceral systems as I am to carceral systems, and I think that the family policing system is a quasi-carceral system. It uses the repressive punishment power of the state to take children, usually Black and brown children, away from their parents. And mandatory reporting is a huge part of that system. And it keeps people from being able to go and get the help that they need because of the requirements that it imposes on people. So I am absolutely opposed to mandatory reporting. We don't need it. If we seriously rethought, so I used to work at the intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment. That was kind of the work I did for a number of years. And when you do that work, what you learn is that most of the kids who are coming to the system are not victims of abuse. They're victims of neglect. And when you really pick through neglect, what that is poverty. If we were willing as a society to actually give people the things that they need to live and thrive, we wouldn't need mandatory reporting, and we wouldn't need a family policing system that is, routinely taking kids out of their communities and their homes.
One of the things that I've heard you speak about that I don't think that I've heard you speak to here is the idea of, well, what if we do gender responsive or trauma informed programs, right? Like we could do, and you talked in your other book about the Nordic model, and I know you do a lot of international work, but
Now you're just letting me rant. You're just enabling me
What
to
are
rant, which
friends
I
for?
appreciate. So what Alicia knows is that I hate the use of the terms both gender responsive and trauma informed in the context of prisons. One of the things that we've seen in the kind of prison reform movement is the idea that you can make a better prison. And if you make a better prison, then it's okay to put people in cages. And the way that we do that for women particularly is to have gender responsive, trauma informed prisons. So far as I can tell, what a gender responsive prison is one that offers stereotypically gendered programming, like cooking and sewing to people, maybe cosmetology classes. And it's impossible to talk about a trauma-informed prison because prison is a trauma factory. It exists to inflict trauma on people. It is trauma all the time. That's an oxymoron. There can't be a trauma-informed prison. And again, with many of these kinds of reforms, the intention is good. If you look at people who are serving time, for example, currently on Rikers Island, that is a horrible place to be a human being. But Rikers Island was a reform, Rikers Island was the better prison. And the problem with building a new prison is that whenever you build a new prison, it will be filled. Right? That's why they exist. And it doesn't matter what you call it, and it doesn't matter what you what the gloss that you put on it, it's still a cage. It's still a cage that requires you to be strip searched when you see your family, and strip searched when you go into certain places, and strip searched when you go to court, where correctional officers have ridiculous amounts of power over you, where that power will absolutely be used to abuse people physically, emotionally, and sexually. You can call it whatever you want, but it's still a cage where harm happens. And so I hate that. And I really wish, the reason that this comes up more recently is in New York. Again, they're trying to get rid of Rikers. They're trying to replace it with a number of different neighborhood-based prisons. And Gloria Steinem came out in favor of the new gender-responsive, trauma-informed women's prison. If you aren't deeply steeped in the literature, you should not talk about what happens in a prison. Everybody who wants to talk about prisons should go spend some time in them. And then we can have that conversation. But if you do that, you'll never ever think that we could have a trauma-informed prison. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question, either in person or online.
Is there any online?
They're still typing.
Keep typing, keep
Okay,
typing.
and I do have one other question, but if you
Okay.
yeah.
So what ties this all together? I'm thinking what ties this all together, and this is well outside what I did, that it's efficient use of resources, mainly money, and it's efficient use of control by a small number of people, driving all of this for what you've talked about. But it applies to almost every facet of society, both in the United States and in other countries. Am I wrong?
Efficient is a weird word for it because I'm not sure the cost efficiencies are there in an economic sense.
We don't like spending money on things.
So
And
certainly,
we don't like involving lots of people in making decisions.
all true. So I would agree with you in that sense. The law professor Jonathan Simon has talked about waste management prisons, that all the problems that we don't want to deal with anymore, we just put all those people in prison, and then we minimize the economics that we put in behind them so that we don't actually provide programming, we don't provide healthcare, we don't provide people with any kind of livable place, but we definitely warehouse people in that way. So I would agree with you in that sense. Yeah. So
How long, in your view, how long should it take to change this?
should
I'm a
or will?
pessimist. I don't think
Should
it'll
or
ever
will?
change. Yeah, I don't think it'll ever
It should
change.
change tomorrow.
Because it's
Will
a
it?
political
No.
decision,
It is.
at least in this country.
I don't believe that I don't think I will see abolition in my lifetime. I think this is a very, very long-term project. Do I think, though, that we can maybe start to shift some of it, some of the smaller pieces? Maybe, but it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, think about the early part of the defund movement. There were city councils that were shifting money out of policing and into services, and then there was retrenchment. And so we have to keep pushing on that. But I mean, as a pessimist, yeah, I can see that. I like Dr. King, right? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Really slowly, really slightly, hard to see, doesn't always feel that way. But I have to believe that. And my little part of that is just to get as many people out of those places as I humanly can. Did they finish typing?
No, I think they're overcome with shyness.
They abandoned the typing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that, typist.
Can I ask you one last question?
Sure.
Is that all right? I kind of want to talk about training and kind of referencing your dilemma and folks who want to make change but are being trained within systems of care that have deeply entrenched ideologies and have really been built from these systems that you're talking about trying to dismantle. Is if there are informed folks who are doing training, like some of us like to think that we are in these settings, but we're in these systems. Do you think that that is a space to begin to dismantle through the way that we do training? through igniting some of these ideas, even if you're constrained in how you can implement them
Yeah.
because you are in these systems of care?
I think so. I mean, you know, the fact that we teach abolition in law schools now is kind of mind blowing, right? What I'm teaching my students is this system sucks and we have to do everything we can to get it burned down, right? And here's how we do that. Like, here's our role in trying to dismantle this system. I think there's such an interesting thing going on in social work right now around decolonizing social work, where there's all kinds of abolitionist social work stuff going on. So you're starting to see these ideas really get into the training spaces and change the way that the people who are coming into the profession see things. And I think that does matter. Is it always popular? You know, I think I probably have more academic freedom than most people. I think law schools are particularly good about that. And I think that, you know, it's harder and easier in different spaces. But there are things that we can do. And even if we're not doing it overtly, you know, teaching inside out classes where you get trained to teach classes that involve both incarcerated people and outside students in the prison setting, just get people proximate to the problem. Let them see it for themselves. And that changes people. So
You have to
I
be
mean, I
very
think we're out of
careful.
time. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You have to be, especially with a name like,
Yes, that one. That is true.
takes time.
Mhm.
Leigh, thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you, Left Bank.
And
Thank you
all
for being
joining
a
us.
small but engaged group.
Yes. We've got books for sale at the desk if you don't have yours yet. We'll move some chairs there if you'd like to get your book signed. If
Happy
you just
to.
want to do that for us,
Yeah,
that'd be great. So thank you all so much for braving the weather tonight.